Good morning again, everyone. As you can see, I'm not Rana. So we have a slightly shorter panel. And first of all, I think we need to thank Rana and Howard, who made Herculean efforts to be here today. I think Howard went to the airport twice in a 12-hour, in DC in a 12-hour period, but we had very serious storms. Apparently, there was even a tornado warning yesterday that no one saw, and so they couldn't make it. So we're going to have an European panel then on the questions of ecosystems and how they challenge traditional antitrust thinking. And A.G. Cantor, who as soon as he retired from the DOJ can become the head marketing person for, I guess, many antitrust conferences, once called ecosystems a whack-a-mole monopolization machine. And I think his notion is that antitrust doesn't know very well what to do with ecosystems. And so we have a really stellar panel again. To my left is Ioannis Lianos, who is the president of the Hellenic Competition Commission and a professor of global competition law and public policy at the University College London. Then we have Sorcha, who is the senior director on mergers at the UK Competition and Markets Authority. And then finally we have Patrick Hey, who is a professor of economics at the University of Toulouse. And I'm Filippo Lancieri. I'm a postdoctor at the ETH Zurich Center for Law and Economics and a research fellow here at the Stigler Center. So we'll start with some questions directly, then we'll try to have something a bit more engaging as a discussion, and I plan to leave plenty of time for Q&A because we want to hear of all of you in the audience as well. So maybe I'll start with Ioannis. So why are we talking about ecosystems? I think you can situate us in the discussion, especially for people who aren't used to it. So why is this so much on the agenda right now?
Well, thank you very much, Filippo and the Stigler Institute for the invitation, and of course, whatever I say today presents only my personal views. So I think the idea of ecosystem is something, of course, that is an empirical reality. I mean, we have seen the emergence of business environments which are marked by modularity in production, coevolution, and decisional complexity. And to a certain extent, the literature, in particular the business literature, I would say, not so much the economic literature, developed in the 1990s a concept of ecosystem, which has had different types of definitions. I mean, some people actually have defined it in broad terms as a group of interacting firms that depend on each other's activities. Others have focused on the alignment structure that we see basically between these different partners in an ecosystem that need to interact for a focal value proposition to materialize. And of course, there has been a lot of emphasis on the role of ecosystem orchestrator, who basically determines the elements of the value chain that need to be internalized and those that basically will be supported externally so as to capture value. So in a way, there has been a lot of discussion about that in the business literature. And we have seen empirically that a number of activities, not only the digital area, but also in the non-digital space, are organized through these ecosystems. And to a certain extent, I mean, competition authorities had to deal with that reality, empirical reality. And somehow we saw an evolution. At the beginning, we have been referring a lot to the concept of platform. But slowly, actually, we're moving towards using more and more the concept of ecosystem rather than that of platform. And in particular, there is this kind of idea that a relevant market is not just the only space or the only field where competition is exercised, but also, this is done in the context of these broader ecosystems. Now, because this was a learning curve in a way for competition authorities, and at the beginning, because we have been using the concept of a relevant market, we have basically been trying to identify a relevant market in which we can find power so as to trigger competition law enforcement. And this is something that somehow makes things more complicated for competition authorities, and to a certain extent, they largely ignored the development of these ecosystems. Now, of course, and we will probably have a discussion later about the different types of competition interaction we can have in this context. So we, more recently, the General Court in the Google Android case recognized the importance of inter-ecosystem competition, and in particular, let's say the horizontal inter-ecosystem competition that exists. However, I would say there has been less focus by the competition authorities on what I would call vertical intra-ecosystem competition, which is basically the value captured through joint collaboration between the ecosystem participants and the ecosystem orchestrator. And I would say the vertical intra-ecosystem competition has been a little bit the blind spot of existing competition law, and I think is at the core of contemporary concerns with these platform orchestrators. To a certain extent, looking to the Apple cases or Google cases. Now, of course, this is slightly changing. We have seen in the new EU Commission market definition notice a specific section on digital ecosystems, so they recognize basically this reality. As I mentioned before, the court in the Google Android case as well. And to a certain extent, I think this is somehow recognized by competition authorities. Now, what I think is still contentious as a matter is a little bit how this could change our view about the role of competition law and the normative, basically, implications of that. And in a certain way, we have to recognize that value is actually generated through these various ecosystem participants who somehow contribute to the value created by this organizational value created by the ecosystem. And I think from that perspective, just focusing on the consumers might be quite reductionist in a certain way, because it will only value a specific part of the organization that somehow generates the value, but not necessarily will focus on the other ecosystem participants that I think are quite significant and important. That's, I think, why we have seen the development of specific regulatory tools to protect these ecosystem participants, and of course the DMA is an example of that.
Thank you so much. This is perfectly on time, even before the time, so it's excellent. We have all 7 minutes as before, and I'm enforcing those 7 minutes. So I'll go to Patrick. Patrick, we heard a lot about ecosystems in general, so what is an ecosystem? How do we identify one? And I would say, okay, that's an ecosystem, that is not.
It's nice to start with an easy question. The basic message is actually quite simple. The antitrust enforcement needs to move away from the notion of relevant markets. That's, I think, is the main message. Susan Haiti already yesterday emphasized that the boundaries of those relevant markets may vary from one case to another, depending on the practices and the facts of the case. But we need to go further and recognize that often, and particularly so in the digital era, customers do not choose between suppliers of a given product. What they do is they choose among platforms, as Susan put it, or ecosystems, as we tend to say more often now. Let me start with a preliminary observation about the notions of substitutes and complements. These play a key role in antitrust. We generally agree that collusion among substitutes is a bad thing. Cooperation among complements may be a good thing. The notion of substitution, supply-side or demand-side substitution, is at the core of the approach towards defining relevant markets. But I would like to stress that this distinction between complements and substitutes is not always very clear. Some products may be complements for some users, substitute for others. Usages may vary over time. But this distinction becomes further blurred when you take into account the fact that customers are often interested in a variety of goods and services, and moreover, value procuring multiple products from the same supplier. And therefore, purchasing decisions are driven by suppliers' assortments, not their relative positions in a given product, but the whole assortments. And they're also driven by the purchasing patterns, such as the value of one-stop shopping versus multi-stop shopping, or single homing versus multi-homing. Now, this is not really brand new. And Ioannis already hinted to the fact that the notion of ecosystem has appeared in business literature, not so much in the econ literature. I think that the economic literature indeed has a bit of a share of responsibility in the current state of affairs. The empirical industrial organization literature often focuses on specific products, such as ready-to-eat cereals, mineral water, yogurts, and there has been good work done on those products. But consumers do not necessarily choose their favorite supermarkets by focusing on which yogurts those markets are offering. There is a very nice paper a couple of years ago in the American Economic Review by Thomasson and 3 other co-authors that for once stepped back and did not focus on one product category specifically, but look at covered the main product categories offered by the retail supermarkets in the UK. And also accounted for the fact that different consumers may have different shopping patterns. Some may want to have everything in one go on the Saturday, buy all the groceries on Saturday afternoon. Others are more prone to mixing and matching and getting their favorite cheese here, their favorite wine there, and so on and so on. And one of the key insights from this research is that the main driver of competition among supermarkets in the UK is precisely the competition for those one-stop shoppers, for those consumers who really want to buy everything from one store, for one visit in a given store. So it is really of first importance to take into consideration the entire range of products offered by the various firms rather than focusing on a single product category. Recognizing the role of customers' purchasing patterns, one-stops, multi-stops, single, multi-homing, and so forth, is also important to understand business practices and their impact on competition and society. In a couple of papers with Zijun Chen, we look at the implications of accounting for this heterogeneity in purchasing patterns among customers. And we show that this heterogeneity of purchasing patterns generates complementarities both within firms but also across firms. Within firms, if one-stop shop benefits, if consumers want to buy everything in the same shop, then if I reduce the price of A, I'm more likely to attract one-stop shoppers to my store, and I can sell them B, C, D, and so forth. But also, if I have a strong position in A, and Sorcha has a stronger position in B, if I reduce the price of my strong product, that may induce at the margin some consumers to move from one-stop to multi-stop and buy my good product A and then visit her store to buy her product B. And therefore, it means that my A and her B can also be complements. Of course, for one-stop shoppers, the situation would be quite different. So you have this interplay of the way consumers will view different offerings, and the same product may be complements for some types of consumers and substitute for others. And accounting for this can provide rationale for practices such as loss leading, for example, even in the absence of any behavioral or informational problems, as the literature usually assume in order to provide a rationale for those practices. You can also provide a rationale for cross-subsidization, even in competitive and possibly highly competitive industries, whereas otherwise typically it is presumed that you need market power to have cross-subsidization. When you account for those kind of shopping patterns and so on, you have very different types of insights. So just a couple of examples that show that moving away from focusing on a single product and looking at the entire range of products, can be really key to have a better understanding of what is going on there. And this is all this without accounting for the fact that contrary to supermarkets are simple in that sense. If you look at digital ecosystems, as Ioannis already pointed out, you have a multitude of players, industry players that are involved in various forms of co-opetition. They cooperate on some dimensions and compete on others. So in a nutshell, we need to move from markets to ecosystems, both in academics and in antitrust enforcement circles.
Thank you. Also, perfectly on time. So, Sorcha, you're probably the regulator most at the forefront of the ecosystem discussion. It's impressive how much the CMA has been doing. So how do you think about theories of harm involving ecosystems in specific cases? How would you articulate what are you looking for in cases, say, this is a bad case versus this is a good case involving an ecosystem?
Thanks, Filippo. And just to note, I'm speaking in my personal capacity as opposed to necessarily reflecting the views of the CMA. So I think, stepping back, fundamentally with merger control, I think it's an exercise of trying to understand how markets operate, how the specific companies that we're looking at operate, and then trying to think about how the transaction might change competition in that market. And when we think about ecosystems, this is a concept that's coming out of how the companies themselves have been developing, and that they see some value in having and developing an ecosystem. In terms of theories of harm, and this, I don't think you can necessarily have an exhaustive approach to this, because I think people are still trying to understand what this means and how it plays out in markets. But I think when we talk about an ecosystem theory of harm, we're typically talking about a concern that a company that has an ecosystem and that has market power is acquiring another company, and that as a result there may be harms such as raising barriers to entry or raising rivals' costs, and that can have a problematic effect on competition. I think those types of harms are not new or novel in themselves. They're things that we've thought about in the past. And I think in terms of how you might assess an ecosystem theory of harm, I think certainly as a starting point, I would expect that at least one approach is to apply, again, the quite familiar ability incentive effect framework, which is how we would generally approach conglomerate type theories of harm in merger control. In terms of what might be notable or different when we think about some of these ecosystem theories of harm, I think the first point I'd make, and this isn't necessarily new or radical, but I think for competition agencies, having looked back at some of the approaches in digital mergers in the past, there's maybe been an appreciation that agencies hadn't fully understood business strategies and the rationales for mergers and so forth. And there's the Lear ex post review of digital mergers that was done in the UK that talked about the importance of focusing on the company's business models and monetization strategies and really properly getting to grips with those things. And I think that plays through in terms of thinking about what a digital ecosystem theory of harm might look like. I think the second thing I would point to is the time horizon in which you're assessing potential harm for the merger. From a merger, and I think this goes perhaps to concepts of a potential efficiency offense. And it is entirely possible that a merger could result in some short-term efficiencies, but could also have a longer-term effect on competition that could raise concerns. You might have a short-term efficiency, but if you have increased barriers to entry that reduce competition over time, that overall effect could in fact be harmful to competition and to consumers. And I'd point to the CMA's merger assessment guidelines, which were updated in 2020. And the guidelines do say that the CMA will consider the impact of foreclosure on potential competitors through raising barriers to entry where the negative impact on customers may take some time to materialize. I think the third thing I'd point to in terms of what might be notable about these theories of harm is that oftentimes we are talking about these harms or these theories of harm potentially arising in markets where innovation is a key parameter of competition, and markets that may be characterized by existing barriers to entry such as network effects and so forth. Obviously that's not unique to thinking about ecosystem theories of harm, but I think those factors may well be present. And so I think that means a number of things. It means that you may be looking at a theory of harm in a market where dynamic competition and the effect of the transaction on future innovation is particularly significant. And I think, there is now precedent from the UK Competition Appeal Tribunal in the Facebook Giphy case that's confirmed that a weakening of dynamic competition is capable of being sufficient to amount to a substantial lessening of competition, which is certainly a position that the CMA had held prior to that case. I think another just general characteristic of looking at markets that are evolving, at looking at markets where you might be thinking about dynamic competition, is that there's a degree of uncertainty. There's always a degree of uncertainty in merger control because it's a forward-looking assessment of markets. That's probably a bit easier when a market has not changed terribly much in the last 5 years and is likely to be relatively similar, but for the transaction going forward. I'd suggest that there is no special evidential burden or standard that applies to these types of markets. And I think also the uncertainty about the outcome of dynamic competition doesn't mean that the loss of such competition cannot be harmful, because with dynamic competition, it's that process of innovation, that threat of potential entry that's often driving the competitive effects, and not necessarily the absolute realization of it, because innovation is inherently uncertain. And I think the final thing, when we are talking about markets that are characterized potentially by existing barriers to entry, that are characterized by innovation as a key parameter of competition, if there's a concern about raising barriers to entry, I think that's a concern that what's going to happen is that you are going to lessen the likelihood of disruptive innovation in that market, lessen the likelihood of new product, services, et cetera, being brought to consumers. And I think that is a significant harm for agencies to consider. That's not to say that ecosystems always lead to bad outcomes. I think ecosystems can lead to good outcomes, but I think there is something for agencies to grapple with in terms of how these do affect markets and how mergers might change those ecosystems or change the competitive dynamics.
Okay, thank you. This is terrific. Again, perfectly on time. So what I think about this whole ecosystem discussion is that it's both at the same time very important but very abstract. So I wanted to start, we were in the morning here, we had a long day yesterday, with a show of hands. So I'm going to give you some names of companies, and you tell me whether you think it's an ecosystem or not. And this applies to the panel, it applies as well to the audience. So please, let's go ahead. So the Apple iOS, who thinks that is an ecosystem? Okay. Google Android. The Apple App Store. No? Okay, so you can have ecosystem within ecosystem. Facebook. No, maybe? Okay. Instagram?
It's part of the ecosystem.
It's part of the ecosystem, but another? Okay. Snapchat, is it related to size or not related to size? No? Yeah, some people, okay.
Remember, you should not focus on a single market, right? A single product.
No, but I'm thinking of the company, that's exactly what I'm asking. So is Uber, does Uber have its own ecosystem, or, yeah? Amazon, I guess. And the final one, is Walmart an ecosystem? Yes, no? Okay, so I think there's a more variation than I would think. So how do we separate an ecosystem from the good old, I think connecting to Patrick's question, just good old one-stop shop, like shopping mall or supermarket? Is it something about the network effects that hold it together? Is it something about necessarily the behavior of consumers, so we cannot have a general theory about an ecosystem? You have always to look at specific cases. How would you start? And maybe you'll start with you, Ioannis, and then we move along.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I think I will distinguish ecosystems for, in clusters or industrial clusters. There's literature in economics about that, but the fact that these are about non-generic complementarities that are basically created in this context, as opposed to generic complementarities that could possibly be, the characteristic of an industrial cluster. And in terms of the supply chain, I would say that, the difference here is that you don't really have an input-output process, clearly, defined, in a sense that, in the vertical complementarity perspective, because of the reasons that what Patrick mentioned in terms of what is a complement is actually much broader. And of course, through the data, kind of influence this idea of complementarity is actually quite broader. So it will not be an input-output, classic input-output process as you will have in the context of a supply chain, for instance. And of course here, the idea is that in the context of a supply chain, I mean, the power of Walmart will be on a specific market in terms of, selling products to final consumers. Now, in the context of an ecosystem, power actually comes from the presence in different markets at the same time, and it doesn't necessarily come from resource dependency. It might come from, let's say, the positioning of a specific company in the context of a broader ecosystem. In terms of that, they are able to control the agenda of the ecosystem, in a sense, who does what. They are able to determine, the allocation of tasks in the context of the ecosystem. They are able actually to have information that comes out from the different parts of the ecosystem, sensitive information that enables them to have a important learning kind of effect power, in a sense, from that perspective. So, I would say this probably differentiates, the ecosystem from industrial clusters and then from supply chains, like traditional supply chains.
Okay. Sorcha, do you agree, or do you think that ecosystems is like a pornography, obscenity here in the US? It's just like I know it when I see it, and you cannot have a general principle for it.
I mean, I guess I think there's maybe a danger in trying to put too much weight on what exactly is an ecosystem. I think when we talk about ecosystems, we're trying to think about how particular markets are operating and how we can better understand them. And we're typically, I think at the moment, trying to grapple with the complexity of markets where companies potentially have disparate services or products within a system that are serving a group of customers. I think they're not necessarily, there's maybe a degree of natural interrelationship between groceries in terms that people are saying, I want to go to one place and get my milk and cereal and juice, which I think is a somewhat different dynamic than when we look at a platform that's bringing quite different services together that isn't necessarily responding to quite the same demand pattern from individuals. And I think it's, when we talk about ecosystems in that context, I think it's an effort to try to understand why are these disparate things together? What does it mean to have those operate within a system? How does that affect competition? I think that's a somewhat different dynamic.
Patrick, what do you think? So I think half the room said that Uber was an ecosystem. As far as I understand, Uber delivers two products, which is ride-hailing and food, or actually food delivery. Would you agree that's an ecosystem or not, and why?
I've carefully tried to avoid putting labels or defining labels in my opening statement, and I'll try to stick to this as much as possible. You mentioned Walmart versus Amazon. So in both cases, there are issues the study I mentioned is specifically a study of good old brick-and-mortar supermarkets in the UK, and there are already some issues that are worth exploring there. Now, if you compare this traditional good old brick-and-mortar supermarket with Amazon on top of doing what a supermarket does, it acts as a marketplace, so it would be more like a mall in that respect than a supermarket. But at the same time, it also has its own shop within the mall. It has also its private label. So it's if we look at the theory of the firm, it's a good model to try to see the various the ways in which some decisions are sometimes taken by the firm, sometimes delegated to others, and so forth. It provides logistics systems that the third-party suppliers may or may not rely upon. It collects data. It is in a position to determine which suppliers are worthy or not, and can provide short-term financial services to that supplier. So it's a matter of a scale in the breadth of the ranges of goods and services that are provided. So it's more of a matter of scale, I would say, than a matter of inherently different in nature.
Okay, and is this something that that we define ex ante the boundaries of the ecosystem. We look at Amazon and say like, no, is this something that you're always going to have to go case by case analysis and say, okay, this is
I'm more interested in the type of issues that that are key in this or that industry, then on putting labels or defining,
I understand,
putting them in boxes.
I mean, I'm trying to play a skeptic role here, and I think that's important. I think my main concern with the ecosystem discussion is that we move from a whack-a-mole monopolization machine where we don't know what we are doing to a, let's say, ultra-differential enforcement machine where we just define, we don't define markets anymore. We just define what an ecosystem is by looking at the case. We don't, we articulate many different theories of harm, and then ultimately, regulators have a lot of leeway to decide whether this is a good or bad outcome for a case. So I want to understand. That's why I'm trying to push you guys to articulate a bit more on this.
Is the same risk that you have with the market definition concept? I mean, you can always make the comment that, of course, we don't never do that in the Great Competition Authority, but of a regulator somehow defining a market narrowly. I mean, the aftermarket type of concept, could be possibly an example of how you can just go and define very, very narrowly a market if you want. I mean, the tool of a relevant market can also be abused in the same way as the concept of ecosystem or any other concept. So I don't think just by mentioning that there could be some form of abuse, you can criticize the concept itself.
No, I'm not. I think that's fair enough. Yeah, please go ahead.
I mean, I think. The way you've posited that question sort of suggests an infinite elasticity to how things operate. And I would come back to, I think market definition, for instance, is a tool. It's an effort, it's something that we can potentially use to better understand competitive dynamics in a market as opposed to sort of an end in itself. And I think with the ecosystem concept, I think that is an effort to try to understand competitive dynamics, but I think you're still coming back to this question of looking at what the evidence tells you about how companies are competing today, how and sometimes when we say competing today, there is a prospective aspect to that because it's dynamic competition, and trying to understand how the merger might change that going forward. And I think trying to understand an ecosystem, in some ways, I think what we're talking about is a conglomerate-style concern, which is not, entirely exotic or unheard of in terms of different things coming together. And I think some of the, questions, if you do, for instance, take the ability incentive effect framework, that is not an unfamiliar framework in merger control. As a result of this acquisition, would their ability to foreclose competitors or raise barriers to entry change? Would the incentive to do so change? What actually would then happen as a result? What would the effect be in the market? I don't think it's straightforward, but I don't think it's completely novel or approach to assessing the transaction.
No, that's fair enough. Patrick, anything to add, or do you want to?
Well, as I said, I'm more interested in trying to understand the issues that arise. To give you two contrasting examples. So there is this debate going on about the so-called tax that Apple or Google or its Android platform is charging to developers. The 30% tax. The parties have argued that competition acts as a discipline device, and therefore they have all the incentives to get it right. Otherwise, they will not be able to attract consumers in the first place. The agencies, including one that is close at the moment, tend to argue instead that competition doesn't seem to be very active. There is little switching among consumers. It doesn't seem to be the case that competition is really particularly strong here. In an ongoing project with Doshin Jeong, coming soon, will be available shortly. We have looked at this, and what we find that actually competition might be the source of the problem rather than a cure. So the question is not whether if the competition is too weak or not. There is competition. And if there is competition, what is the incentive of one platform to encourage the development of apps that will end up being available on the rival platform as well? So it does not really contribute to enhance their relative differentiation, added value. It's interesting to look at the situation in the Chinese market. So you have there, Apple is not in China. You have multiple, Chinese manufacturers of smartphones, all mostly on the Android platform, each one with its own app store, and the tax there is not 30%; it's 50%. So you have more competition, and you have even higher commissions. So maybe the approach to this may not be to try to promote, foster competition for consumers, but maybe competition among the app stores themselves, within the platform. That may be a possible way into some form of kind of price regulation, fair pricing or whatever. Maybe, I don't know, like in the DMA, there is a provision going in this direction. That may be a better competition. Doesn't seem to be the right way out here. It is competition among platforms, within the platform maybe. Contrast this with the Amazon has been, the dual role of empire and player has been put forward. So the Amazon acts as a marketplace, but it's also the regulator of this marketplace, and also on this marketplace, it's also present as one of the players among the others. There has been this so-called hold-up policy that has been questioned. Amazon coming in, stepping in when there is a particularly profitable, successful product, copycatting, introducing a Me Too, and so on. Well, if you step back, you can look at this as one way of one more instrument in the private regulator's toolbox of the toolbox of Amazon as a private regulator of its platform. It means that it puts a cap on the profitability of the successful products. It means that there is a transfer from those products to consumers, which will attract consumers, which in turn will benefit to the other sellers on the platform. So the question, maybe a better way of looking or assessing the impact of this type of practice is to see to what extent the private regulators' incentive and what would be a public regulator's incentive, objective, are the extent to which they are aligned. And as well, we have another project on this with Doshin, which says, the private regulator does a pretty good job. It's not perfectly aligned with what a public regulator would do, but it's not necessarily compared with no private regulation whatsoever. That may not be the right way. So you really have to look at what are the issues that arise.
Yeah, but let me just build and then I get to you. But I think everybody would agree in an antitrust conference that the main question is how do you define competition? But we have tools like relevant market definition and others to try to shape our approach to thinking about these topics. So almost everybody here agreed that Apple iOS and Android are two ecosystems in themselves. But then when you see cases that will involve app stores, many times what you see is that regulators exclude these as two competitive matters. So the Dutch, for example, they have a report about Apple app stores where they basically say these are not two competing platforms, they're basically two monopolies that compete at each other at some level. So I think that the question that arises exactly is I'm perfectly fine with abandoning relevant market definition. I don't have any fetish on that. But then how do you articulate these theories of harm in terms of competition? Do ecosystems mostly compete against each other? Do they mostly compete against their own complementors? And if you find some kind of violation, does it mean that you can, in one complementor, just intervene in the whole ecosystem, the ecosystem as a whole? So how would you think about this?
I think the concept is useful. First, empirically, a lot of value is now generated in ecosystems. So from that perspective, there's value generated with these complementarities that are somehow put in place by the firms. But I think that's not really the focus here. I would say what is really bringing this new concept, this concept is this focus on the capture of surplus value, in the sense of distribution, basically of value. I think that's I think why, from my perspective, this concept is useful. And there, of course, you might have the, intra-ecosystem horizontal competition in the sense that, the platform can also be a merchant, so they can basically compete horizontally with their complementary, with the complements. But I think the other aspect which possibly the relevant market concept could not necessarily take into account is what I call the intra-ecosystem vertical competition. In the sense, what is the fair, basically, allocation of value between the various participants in the ecosystem. And this is not necessarily, a traditional competition concept in the US where you don't really focus on exploitation. It can definitely be something that, from a European perspective, could be interesting because we actually are, focusing on exploitation. And to a certain extent, the regulatory tools that we have developed, because to deal with the ecosystems, and in particular the surplus value issue, you cannot necessarily only use a competition tool. I mean, it's a toolkit approach, and this is more or less what the European Union has been promoting. I mean, it's actually a combination of tools. So the competition enforcement, which obviously has a number of issues with regards to the length of time that you need in order to be able to intervene, and what can actually have as an outcome. But at the same time, we have the Digital Markets Act, which is basically sort of utilities-like regulation, not in the sense of entry or tariffs, but in the sense of specific types of conduct that could be problematic if done by the gatekeepers. Okay. And then, the Data Act, which actually deals with situations where you don't really have this kind of, gatekeepers, but there is some form of unequal bargaining, right, between the platform and the complementers. So, which actually, shows that one of the, the issues here is about the fairness aspect, and this is why, I think the concept of ecosystem could be of interest. So, not necessarily completely agree with Patrick in that perspective. Yeah.
Sorcha, do you agree? So when you look at a case, would you look at what is the fairness of the internal distribution, or?
So I might just come back first to your initial question, because I think you're asking, what is the market, and is this about ecosystems competing with each other? And I don't think that's typically the question that's being asked. What we're talking about with an ecosystem is actually a firm that has positions in multiple different markets, and what the sum of those positions mean in terms of the potential market power of that firm. And there may be places where actually having positions in multiple markets and bringing those together in itself results in a degree of market power. And I think a few years ago we looked at a case, Google Looker, and it was a phase 1 clearance, but one comment made in that case was about Google's position in advertising and in some of the data analytics and so forth, and that those things together resulted in a degree of power as a result of its ecosystem position. So this isn't, you could say when people are buying phones, they're buying into ecosystems, and there's a degree of duality there. But I think what we're talking about here primarily is not that, but rather when someone is present in those multiple markets and they add another likely disparate entity or market or product to that system. What does that mean for the overall system? What does that mean in terms of the ability of someone to enter one of those markets competitively? Does that make it harder in one of those markets? And does that mean as a whole that you're lessening competition? I think realistically, if you've got a company that's present across 8 or 10 different markets and has a degree of market power, the point of entry is probably not going to be someone who jumps into 8 or 10 markets simultaneously and replicates that company. It's going to be probably entry in one of those markets, or actually entry in a slightly different adjacent space that starts to pull away some of the existing consumers. And that type of disruptive innovation, I think, is what's actually characterized a lot of these markets over time, where people have come in and entered and developed. It's not necessarily been with a duplicate of what's existed already, but rather with a slightly different proposition, potentially in a slightly different market that started to change the overall dynamics. And so I think that is kind of the concept that we're grappling with, and the question that we're asking ourselves as we look at transactions, and also as we look at behavioral and other.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you this. So, you think the rationale is the same if you're looking at a merger, or if you're looking at a natural expansion to an adjacent market? So if there's no acquisition, would you look at exactly the same things and have the same theory, or no?
Well, I mean, I think fundamentally, a firm developing something for itself is often a competitive response in a different way that an acquisition of a target is a competitive response. I think, the concern with an acquisition of a target can be that they're preventing competition from developing, or they're preventing others from accessing something, et cetera. When you look at a firm that's developing something new on its own, oftentimes that itself is an output of competition in the market and that firm responding to things. So I think, I don't think as a competition agency we typically assess someone's innovation as a potential problem. I think once there has been innovation, if a firm has a terribly big position, the innovation isn't the problem. You may look at how that position's being exploited, but that's something probably a long way down the line and quite different.
Patrick.
First, a brief comment on you refer to the Dutch report saying there is little competition among those platforms, and in the research conducted with Doshin on this, what we found is that the degree of competition or the degree of substitution between platforms, so the degree to which consumers would be willing to switch from one to another, is not really one of the main drivers of the level of the tax that they would charge to developers. A more important driver would be the extent to which developers develop their apps for multiple platforms as opposed to developing their apps for one particular platform. So the degree of increasing multi-homing in the sense that the decision to develop an app is made on the overall profitability that they can get across all the platforms, that's really what matters. And the more important that dimension is, the more likely you have to have that competition is not going to work, whatever the degree of switching that you may have on the consumer side. On conglomerates, when you enter multiple markets, so again, you may provide some kind of consumption synergies and one-stop shop benefits, which is good for consumers. So there might be some efficiency benefits. At the same time, it may create some differentiation, some portfolio differentiation between the kind of portfolio that the conglomerate will be able to offer as opposed to the standalone firms that are competing in more specializing on given markets. So that may create some market power in that sense by creating this kind of portfolio differentiation. We have another project ongoing with Zijun, and I did not say this one is going to come up shortly, but we are still working on it. Preliminary findings show that as long as you don't have bundling, pure bundling, as long as the conglomerate still offers the various products on a standalone basis, this portfolio differentiation is not that too problematic, except if you really have high degree of market power in given some of those individual markets. So the last comment I would like to make is prompted by your last intervention about how do you enter? How would you manage to enter and so on? It's true, again, and Susan also alluded to this. I'm going back to substitutes, the reliance of substitutes. The typical, if you look at potential entry, usually the good potential entrants are the ones who would be really close to the incumbents because they are the ones who are most likely to impose some effective competitive pressure on the incumbent. If you introduce network effects, as which is often relevant in the context of digital ecosystem, if everyone is already on this social media, if I come up with an alternative social media which is really a replica of what is existing, it's unlikely that I will convince the consumers to switch all together from the platform where they are currently to my own platform. It's more likely that I will be able to attract some of those consumers if I come up with something that is quite different from what is existing. So the more away from the existing one, the more likely I may be to start winning some consumers and then start the ball rolling and so on, and maybe eventually I will be able to challenge the incumbent. So again, it's when you take this, those network effects and scale economies can be another, the role of data may be another important aspect. When you take this into account, you may come up with a different type of views on the scope, what would be the relevant source of potential competition, for example.
Well, what does this mean? Sorry, I'll come to you. What does this mean for theories of harm as well? Because one would think that one of the main sources of efficiency in large digital markets is exactly when the very large platform adopts a product and distributes to 3 billion users at the same time rather than this fringe competitor. So if I understand more or less what you say is that we should be less worried about when platforms are entering very adjacent markets than when they're actually entering more distant markets, which could potentially develop into more meaningful competitor in the long term. Is this what you're meaning or not at all?
What I'm saying is that when you take into account some of the features that are prevalent salient in those industries, like the role of network effects, then you may want to revisit your views about what would be the source, what it would be the role, the nature of an effective potential competition. That's all what I'm.
Okay. Sorry, you wanted to jump in and I cut you.
I want to say just, of course, inter-ecosystem competition is important, and to a certain extent, it's an empirical issue each time. In the Android case, the court, and I was just reading now, basically, discussed if there was competitive pressure between Apple and Google, and basically they said, well, that's not the case, because they had this revenue sharing agreement that was conditional on Google search being set as a default on Apple's mobile internet browser, Safari, and as a result of that, there was no incentive to operate on those markets and compete, Google says. So in a way, the inter-ecosystem competition was actually taken into account by the court. Now, it might be, and obviously said that it was not sufficient. It might be that in some situations, it could possibly, be possible to make an argument that there is sufficient inter-ecosystem competition that, to a certain extent, could possibly provide opportunities for switching of, or ecosystem homing to a certain extent. But again, this is an empirical issue depending on the facts of each case in this context.
And which facts would you look for?
Christina wants to come in.
Sorry, Christina has been.
I'm really dying.
Dying. So
This discussion is so confused and confusing. I don't know what the audience is beginning to make. Can I say something?
Of course, let's just wait for a microphone so you can jump in.
I just can look at the faces and everybody's saying, what on earth are they talking about? And I get it, because no one has the faintest idea. You're all talking across purposes. And the important thing is the framing here. Okay. In antitrust, and I mean conduct, we have tools that we use. We don't need to just go off into ecosystem theories, because when it comes to App Store, when it comes to Amazon, when it comes to these conduct concerns, we have the tools, we know what we're talking about. No one in a serious way is suggesting we should switch to some sort of ethereal ecosystem theories. I know that Ioannis, who talks a lot to his strategic management friends, likes to talk about capturing value, value creation. That's stuff in the strategic management literature that no one in antitrust cares about. So that is the point, number one. Number two, the only reason we're talking about this at all, and it's topical, is because of what Sorcha says. Because there are deals now in front of the agencies which are deals in which digital platforms are buying an asset or a capability which is not in their main market. And so what the agencies are doing, and what Sorcha rightly is saying, is, okay, we have theories of harm that are horizontal, vertical, conglomerate. The vertical and conglomerate tend to rely traditionally on leveraging mechanisms, okay? I have a tie, I have a bundle, I have a raising rivals cost, I have a mechanism for raising power from market A to market B. What if I want to go beyond that? And I ask myself, okay, you're big company X, you have a position in cloud, you're very big, you have a position in operating system, you have a position in some sort of storefront, you have a position in something, and you're buying something else. How do I think as a regulator of this collection of assets and capabilities that you control? I'm not suggesting you're going to tie A and B or bundle A and B, but do I need to worry about the fact that you have all these levers that you can pull and you can create bottlenecks and some sort of barriers to entry through the variety of assets that you hold? Q, Microsoft, Activision. Q, iRobot, Amazon. These are the deals, and I confess I haven't, of course I've disclosed, I've advised Microsoft on this, I've got no role in Amazon, so just to be clear. But these are the questions, nothing else relevant. This is why we're discussing this at all, because no one is really out there talking about an ecosystem antitrust conduct theory. It is really about this. And the question is, A, can the IO economists kind of think about a way of developing economics that is actually important and relevant to this? Because what the agencies are saying is, I haven't got a way of articulating this concern about multiple assets. Because rightly or wrongly, the defendant says, sorry, what's your problem? You've got assets, you've got stuff, is not a theory of harm. Kind of, yeah, I get that. You've got stuff, is not a theory of harm. So how does this stuff gel and make the souffle rise? This is the question they're grappling with, the FTC is grappling with, and this is what they need an answer to from economists. The strategic management people, frankly, can only talk about value capture, blah. And I don't think the answer is coming from that. Last point, the network economics people are interesting. Watch this space, because they are the only ones who are beginning to say, oh, in fact, there are networks of assets and capabilities. A merger isn't buying a product. It's not the market share of product X you're buying. Particularly in these kind of worlds, you are buying a set of assets that you plonk into your own constellation of assets and capabilities, and those combine into something that can be good, can be less good. That's how we find out. How do we find out? This is the only relevant question in all of this, and that's why we're talking about this.
I guess you disagree, so
definitely
if you have more questions, feel
free.
It
depends on which type of debate. I mean, definitely the competition field, yes, it is a relevant question. But here we don't have to deal only with competition law enforcement intervention. I mean, how can you explain the DMA if you actually, basically say that, fairness is not an issue? I mean, fairness, it is an issue in the DMA. So for competition law enforcement, yes, I agree. I mean, definitely, that might be, although I have to say as well, that we have unfair commercial practices type of possible theories of conduct in the EU competition law, which could possibly be used in this context, and therefore the fairness aspect also comes through that type of theories of harm, which Christina has been mostly focusing on exclusionary type of theories of harm, as far as I understand.
Sorcha, what do you think of fairness? This fairness discussion in ecosystem, is it valuable as well, or should we only be looking at exclusion?
I mean, I guess I'm coming at this from a merger control perspective, and that is where I would think about ecosystems. And so I don't think that that is about fairness primarily. That is about, this question of what, when we've got a company that has an existing ecosystem and market power, what does the addition of another entity mean, and how is that going to change the dynamic? And is that going to substantially change the competitive power of the company? Is it going to make it harder for people to compete? And I don't think those are fairness considerations. I think those are, to some extent, bog standard competition concerns. Is there a substantial lessening of competition? What's not bog standard is the fact that, it's a different way of trying to look at or conceptualize things, which is not, about the competition agencies inventing something. It's about the competition agencies looking at how these businesses are operating in the markets. And while we may not have, I think to Christina's point, great maths on this so far, I think when you look at companies and how they're operating, when you look at things like internal documents and strategy and so forth, you can see that companies themselves often think that there is value and benefit in these things, and may in fact have said things that indicate that they do think that these ecosystems, create a moat, lessen the likelihood of competition. And I think when a company is engaging in an acquisition in order to build a moat to a competition agency, you start to sit down and think, well, that sounds an awful lot like making it harder for people to enter. And if that's the case, that's potentially something concerning to us. And that's potentially concerning even if there are some short-term benefits, which there may be a degree of benefit. And at that point, you're doing an exercise of trying to understand what the overall effect of the transaction is.
If you have any questions, please go ahead. I'll ask something. So you mentioned the Lianos. Oh, sorry, please go ahead, Patrick.
I think that as Ioannis mentioned, I think the DMA is interested in other issues than the ones you raised. But you're right that this idea that combining multiple products on the same roof may trigger some questions that have been overlooked at the moment. You can have, again, the fact that consumers may value having everything from one supplier may convey more power to the ones who manage to offer more products to those consumers. The role of data, I'm surprised that it has not been really emphasized so far in the discussion, but if you collect more additional pieces of data, thanks to by offering a different type of products and so on, and you can use this data in other markets on which you are always active, that also may be something that needs to be accounted for a bit more. So we need more of that I agree.
So you mentioned the Lianos report, which analyzed the Facebook-Instagram mergers. Let's try to discuss a concrete case. And basically, the main conclusion of the report is that the CMA did, unfortunately, a very bad job because they analyzed it mostly as a vertical case rather than a potential horizontal case. So how do you think effectively, and I ask the three of you, I don't want to put Sorcha only on the spot, that this theory of ecosystem and capabilities and et cetera would have, do you think it would have fundamentally shifted the result of the case? How would be the shift?
I mean, from my perspective, I mean, the German Facebook case, which is basically an exploitation case, and this is a little bit also, coming a little bit to the perspective that, it's not just about exclusion. I mean, what was the remedy in this case? It was basically an ecosystem separation, data separation remedy, but because of this exploitative element. So fairness and exploitation are important elements that we need to take into account. We can do that in the context of the obviously regulatory interventions like the DMA, possibly also in competition enforcement interventions. For instance, even in merger cases, theoretically, by being able to add a specific type of activity which enables you to collect data and be able to exploit more, either freelancers or users, etc., is possibly a theory of harm that could be used also to block a merger in this context, or preferably actually to impose some form of data ecosystem separation remedy. But that would be an exploitation concern rather than exclusionary concern. Mm-hmm. Only, I mean, it could be basically both, what I'm saying, but not only just exclusionary one.
So I'm not convinced that you need to start thinking about an ecosystem theory of harm. I mean, I think relitigating Facebook, Instagram is always, we all love to do it, but I think trying to go back in time and think about exactly what people understood at that time and would it be different, I think is quite difficult. But when you look at reasons that perhaps Facebook, things that could have been done differently in Facebook, I don't think my starting point would be that the agency should have looked at an ecosystem theory of harm. I think some of the issues that came up there were around perhaps how well digital advertising markets were understood, and when agencies were looking at what it meant to combine Instagram and its potential opportunity to sell digital advertising. Did agencies really understand what was of value there, what was really being monetized, and the extent of what was being brought together in that transaction? Perhaps were to somewhat unique assets that would target the same user bases and so forth. And I think that is a more standard type of question on a horizontal. And I don't think you need to get into an ecosystem theory of harm. I think there were also questions around how foreclosure had been assessed. And again, I think it was about how well the business models and the operation in the market were understood, but it wasn't something terribly exotic. It was about I think Instagram was seen, certainly in the OFT, which was our predecessor's decision, largely as a photo sharing app, which I think is probably not quite what we think Instagram is today. But one of the questions was whether that photo sharing capability could be cut off to other social networks, and that would be sort of foreclosure. And I think the assessment at the time was that basically Instagram users like to share with other social networks so that there wouldn't, that wasn't realistic. And I think some of the criticism there was, whether there had really been an assessment done as to how important the ability to share across networks was to Instagram users, which, if it wasn't terribly important, your ability to engage in foreclosure would be different. And so, I think ecosystem theories of harm are interesting because they potentially allow us to think about something that we're not well able to think about in some of the more traditional approaches we've taken to things. But I don't think that means that you always would want to go to an ecosystem theory of harm, including in a case where the merging party might actually have an ecosystem. Most cases are about horizontals, they're about verticals, they're about theories of harm on that basis. I mean, today, looking at the Facebook, sort of how Facebook exists, what we say Instagram is part of an ecosystem, we might say that, but I don't think that means it was necessarily the most salient theory of harm at the time of that acquisition.
Patrick, what do you think? Nothing to...
No, I think that's not my main comparative advantage compared to legal scholars and authorities.
That's fair enough. And just to understand, so you think that these are the capabilities that Christina is mentioning in the discussion exactly? It's like the ability to, monetize data, to collect. So how would you see as like key capabilities that you look at in a concrete case as defining features of competition in a given market or in a given ecosystem? So exactly what are capabilities? That's my question. So how would you define what a capability is?
I mean, I think when we're talking about an I don't think that the concept of ecosystem is defined by specific capabilities that exist. I think, it's perhaps hard to come up with wild examples, but, that fundamental idea that positions across multiple markets sum up to create a degree of power, and that has effects across markets. I don't think that's about, necessarily is that because people have exclusive access to particular data, even if we say a lot of ecosystems may actually involve companies that have significant data advantages. I don't think that the things like that are what's defining the ecosystem. I think it's this very basic point about the positions across multiple markets, and are they coming together in a way that's creating market power that, I think Christina's point is fair, that it's not about leveraging in the sort of old school, I have a product, I've got a product in an adjacent market, I'm going to bundle them together, or I'm going to, do a traditional tie. It's looking at sort of less direct interconnections between those positions and the degree of power that's creating.
I wanted to finish the discussion on the questions. I mean, you mentioned the DMA and the DSA and others about this distinction between what can antitrust do versus what regulation should do. And then you mentioned a lot of these questions about anti-discrimination. So how do you see, Ioannis, the boundary between the Facebook German case, which is ultimately an exploitative case, and what the DMA is trying to do? And for example, in Sorcha, it's like the CMA has been trying to get more regulatory powers and has not yet, but maybe we'll get soon, who knows? So how much can you think you can accomplish with today's systems versus what you should do?
I mean, obviously it's too early to say. Because these regulatory initiatives have just been in the process of being implemented. And I think what is interesting is also to have experimentation going on. I mean, in particular, you have specific countries in Europe, like Germany, that have tried with on Article 19A of the German Competition Act to basically deal with this reality of ecosystem without using the word ecosystem. But of course, it's basically about having some form of provision or expose basically competition enforcement that could deal with abuse of ecosystem power. We in Greece actually tried to do the same. Unfortunately, did not. The Parliament actually did not adopt the proposal that we framed. And of course, you have other tools like the market investigation reference tool, what the UK has and Germany is now adopting, and of course other jurisdictions as well have already, which could deal with these possible theories of harm in the context of ecosystems, both exclusory as well as explorative. So I think there's already quite an elaborate toolkit. It's not entirely clear how this will interact with the competition enforcement, exposed competition enforcement. But again, at least at the European side, I think there is a very, elaborate toolkit approach which might deal with all possible theories of harm, both exclusionary and exploitative, in the context of ecosystem. Now, the question is, are other jurisdictions going to adopt equivalent type of toolkit approaches? I mean, is exploitation going to be a concern in the US, for instance? Because of course, I fully, accept the exclusionary potential and possible fears of harm that from exclusionary perspective. But I think one of the defining features of the European approach is also this emphasis on fairness.
Patrick, you mentioned when you're discussing, the bullet points, you said that antitrust may be too slow and regulation is too rigid. So how do you find the spot for intervention there?
Let's see, the Intel case started in which year already? Remind me.
Yeah. Many years ago.
So, and it's still going on. And so yes, antitrust can be a bit slow. So recognizing this, we went for the DMA option. So we went for a regulatory approach. My concern with this is that, so you have the DMA. So some people will say this is the shopping list of all the cases that the Commission would have loved to be able to do and could not with the usual enforcement, antitrust enforcement power. But it's a bit, looking at the past. It's based on what has been going on in the and now that we have those rules that are being put in place, there is a concern that once they are there, they will have their life of their own. It will be very difficult to adapt them if the markets and the industry or as the industry evolves. When Pierre Gibaud, the chief economist of DG Comp, asked some of the members of the Economic Advisory Group for Competition Policy to have a look. This was at the beginning before we opted for the DMA. So looking at options, he asked us to look at the experience in the UK experience with the market investigations. Prima facie, I was doubtful because what I had seen of this was the code of conduct for supermarkets and so on, which did not impress me as being very effective. So we look at this. This was with Monica Schnitzer and Greg Crawford. And I must say that we have been very impressed with the track record of this instrument. So this is an instrument which is in between antitrust and regulation, where the agency looks at a particular industry because it has the feeling that there are problems there, identifies the problems and try to determine remedies, which including breakups sometimes, for the London airports, for example, or for the cement industry and so on. And sometimes, other remedies that are really tailored to address the problem that I have identified. And therefore, from one industry to another, the remedies can be very different. And they are each time tailored to whatever. And I think that this is more interactive in a sense. This is quite fast. Nothing like the Intel timeline. And I would have loved that if we could have explored this a bit more at the EU level.
Okay. So let me just ask, so how do you see, because the CMA has the tools that Patrick is mentioning, but you're actively asking for more power to do more what Ioannis is trying to get as well. So how do you see this dynamic there?
I think we're talking about a few different things. I think, I think our market study function is a general function. And I think the DMU proposal is responding to particular concerns. I'm not sure that any of them are sort of fundamentally tied to ecosystems. I think one thing with the market study tool, again, this isn't necessarily about ecosystems, but more about digital markets. I do think one of the learnings, and again, I go back to the Lear report, was around how well do agencies actually understand the operations of these markets broadly? And I think the market study power has been really useful when you look at something like the digital advertising market study that our teams did a couple years ago. I think it's an opportunity to look at a market broadly and try to understand how competition is working in that market. And I think that's not something you can do in the same way in an individual case. And then obviously at the end of a market study or a market investigation, there can be interventions, but that's something quite specific. I think when we look at the proposals around the digital markets unit, that again, I don't think is specifically tied to concepts of ecosystems. I think that's been about a general review of the digital landscape, the fact that it's been dominated by a small group of players for a long period of time, and looking at the ability to put powers in place to introduce things like a code of conduct or pro-competitive interventions, things like interoperability or data portability, et cetera. And I think that those, when you look at any of those on their own, I think they are addressing problems that have been discussed for a long period of time. I think some of those problems are around network effects, and it's, creates the opportunity for greater competition. But, again, I think while some of the ecosystems we're talking about may be characterized by network effects, I don't think network effects are necessarily an ecosystem problem per se. I think that's, a sort of long-established concept, and, the DMU proposals are around sort of addressing some general concerns about how markets are operating.
Final remarks.
I just wanted to say, we have been criticizing antitrust to be long, etc. But of course, we started these investigations at the time when we did not have enough learning on ecosystems or platforms, okay? And I think what is interesting now is to see the experience of the specific tools like Article 19A, all the use by some authorities of existing tools that they have, like abuse of economic dependence, and how quick they are exposed to deal with the issue, okay? So it might be that we have been criticizing ex post enforcement and antitrust being long, but maybe, let's see how long they take, these specific type of new tools. And possibly, they're not going to be that long, because a market investigation reviews can also be a little bit long as well. You have to do these public consultations, so it's not really something you can actually finish in a year. Definitely have at least 1.5 or 2 years to finalize. So now it's a time to compare a little bit the various tools and see, in terms of effectiveness, which is the most effective one in terms of time.
Okay, thank you. So stay tuned for next year. We have panels discussing what the DMA has achieved, or maybe it's going to be too early. But thank you very much, everyone. We're going to have a break now. Thank you.